We can get started, and I want to welcome everyone from around the world. We are having a global conversation this evening on race, the LDS Church, and where we go from here. Thank you so much for joining us. I know that we have people who are joining from as close as Salt Lake City, where I'm based, and as far away as Johannesburg, South Africa. Yes, I see you. And I welcome all of you, my brothers and sisters. We have people joining us from Sweden, from Paris, from Atlanta, Georgia, from Los Angeles, and everywhere in between, because I think we all can innately sense that we are in a pivotal time in relation to all of human history. And I think that many of us have felt like not only are these conversations vitally important and long overdue, but especially with the stress the world is facing with COVID-19, with peaceful protests, as well as riots, as well as arguments happening all over the world, with the recent events that have happened that have affected each one of us, in seeing George Floyd basically choked to death right before our eyes while in police custody, and hearing about Breonna Taylor, and watching Ahmaud Arbery be gunned down, and the people who were responsible for his death, for his murder, weren't arrested until after protests and such broke out. We're at a pivotal time, and I felt the need and the call to have a conversation about these issues, a conversation that is grounded in civility, in sincerity, in a desire to be open and to connect with each other, and a desire to build bridges instead of walls. And so I talked to dear friends that I have, and this is another thing that I want to make clear about this conversation. This isn't going to be a perfect conversation, right? This isn't professionally produced. We're not in studios, we're in our homes. This isn't scripted, it's not rehearsed, so it is going to be far from perfect. The only thing that we promise you is that it's going to be sincere and that we'll be speaking from our hearts. This isn't a political conversation. In fact, we are here to transcend politics. We're here to transcend stereotypes and putting each other into boxes and making each other natural enemies because we're on different sides of the aisle, or because we're in different parts of the world, or we have different belief systems. This is a conversation involving people who are members of the Church of Jesus Christ and Latter-day Saints, but it is in no way exclusive to members of the church. I'll speak for myself. I couldn't care less whether you're the most active Latter-day Saint on the planet, if you're the prophet himself, hello, President Nelson, shout out to you, or if you are an atheist, if you've never heard the name Jesus Christ, you are welcome here. If you are gay, straight, undecided, if you are Black, white, Jewish, Asian, Latino, whoever you are considered a member of our human family, and you matter, and your voice is important. And I really want to welcome you to the table, to the conversation. And I also want to start with saying that in our church, we have the belief that we were all on the same side of the aisle, if you will, all on the same side of the fight for good, for free agency, for justice, fighting alongside Christ. All of us, every human being alive in the world today and who has ever lived on planet Earth was all on the same side. So that means whether you are the most fervent Muslim living in the Middle East, or you're the strongest atheist who ever lived, you're all a part of the same human family, and we all decided to come here together as brothers and sisters. So this is a call for us to learn to act like brothers and sisters, and to talk about what's going on in our minds and in our hearts during these troubled times. I especially wanted to give a voice to a conversation representing people who all too often are voiceless or underrepresented in their point of view, especially in the Mormon world, but in the world at large. But like I said, this isn't going to be a perfect conversation. So I still use the term Mormon. There are those who don't like that term. Forgive me, Latter-day Saint, but this isn't about sanitizing conversation. This is about speaking with sincerity. So I just wanted to make the intention clear that each one of us has, that we wish to break down barriers and connect with each other and to have a heart-centered, impactful conversation. Number one, that's my intention. Number two, you might be asking yourself, well, why should I join? What is in this event for me? And I want to answer that question. Maybe if you're someone like myself, you have a son, you have a child who you're concerned may go out into the world one day and not come back alive because someone has misjudged him or her due to the color of his skin or due to his racial makeup. That's a genuine fear that I hold. So if that's how you feel, if you can relate to that, then you're in the right place. I really think this is a conversation that will benefit you. Let's say you have a son or daughter who's a member of the police force and you're worried they're gonna go home, they're gonna leave the home, and not come back alive. This is a conversation for you. I think the whole world is benefited when we can come together and we can figure out a way to offset fear and increase understanding and increase connection. So this conversation is for you. Maybe you're confused about what role you're supposed to play in all of this. Maybe you're a white person who feels that your voice isn't being heard, or that the term racism is being thrown around too loosely, or that maybe you're a white person who's wants to be an ally, but you're not sure where to begin. This conversation is for you. Basically, from my point of view, this conversation is for all of us. It's for every human being living on the planet, because we all benefit when we can put away our weapons of war and start to see each other for the daughters and sons of God and the truth of who we really are. So again, without further ado, welcome to the conversation. Let me introduce our esteemed panel, okay? We're regular people. None of us is Martin Luther King, right? He unfortunately was assassinated, so he's not here with us today. We're regular people. None of us are getting paid to do this. We have various levels of experience speaking out for racial justice, but we're coming from the place of ordinary human beings who want to have a conversation. So I'll start with Pactrick McGinley. Welcome, Pactrick. Pactrick, as far as we know, is the first African-American male to serve a mission and complete a mission in the state of Utah. He's been a member of the church for how long?
Since 1987. No, 86. Wow. Years go fast.
Okay. 1986. So you're hanging strong, and we're so happy that you're here with us. Thank you for joining us. I'm not sure if we all are seeing the same screen, because I was going to go clockwise, but I'm hearing clockwise for you isn't necessarily the same for me, so I'll just pick a name. Marvin Perkins, you might be familiar with him through his work for the past 20 years with Blacks in the Scriptures. If you aren't familiar with it, please check it out. It's amazing. He also has a secular adjunct to this work called the B1 Initiative. He's been a member of the church for 30 years and working for more than 20 years to bring about greater understanding of racial justice issues. And he's worked tirelessly to clear up lots of misconceptions in the church and in the body of scriptures as a whole, having to do with the curse of Cain and the Lamanite curse and skin color and racism and all kinds of stuff. Check him out, and please help me welcome Marvin Perkins. Next, I would like to introduce you to Josh Black. Josh Black was born a member of the church, born and raised in Boise, Idaho. He is the father of a mixed race child. He is a graduate of Caltech, PhD in chemical engineering, and an ally. And we're very happy that you have joined us today, Josh. James is co-founder, I want to make sure I get this right, co-host of the podcast Beyond the Block, which is a podcast that focuses on the conversation of marginalized Mormon people. So definitely something that you would want to check out. So thank you, and help me to welcome James. And we have Laura. Laura is a professor of German linguistics at BYU University in Provo. and she is an ally, and we're very happy that you are with us. And I am Candy, and I'm your host. And why don't we just jump right in? I also wanted to mention that because this conversation about racism, about social justice, about everything that's going on in the world is so broad, there's no way we could fit it all in one 90-minute conversation. So we decided we'd like to have an ongoing weekly conversation, same time, same place, different panelists, but Marvin and I will be here next Sunday for sure. And then we will continue the conversation from that point. So if you'd like to join us, like I mentioned, this is a global conversation, so you can be anywhere in the world. Please contact me and let's keep the conversation going. With that, tonight I think I'm going to distill our focus down to some of the topics that are really hot button issues at this time. So I don't think we could have a conversation about race without having a conversation about systemic racism. And the fact that it's become popular in today's racial climate for many people to deny the existence of systemic racism, and for many to feel like this is now a moot talking point. We had the civil rights movement that was 50 years ago. Why are we still talking about this issue now? So Marvin, I'd like to invite you to give your perspective on systemic racism and share with us if you've had any experiences around this issue and what your feeling is and what you would like people to know about that.
Thanks, Candy. Again, thanks for having me. Really happy to be here. Again, growing up an African American in the U.S., we've all have experienced systemic racism, not being able to get a job, or not being able to get a loan, or not being able to live in a certain neighborhood. Just talking to an aunt of mine, and when they tried to move into the area, their house was burned down 4 times as it was built, being built. I mean, so there's just a ton of that there. And the question is, I think I heard 2 questions in there. There's folks that are saying, why are we still talking about this? Well, those folks just don't understand exactly the systemic nature of the racism. And so with that in mind, it becomes important for us that do understand it to have the hearts to be able to deliver those understandings or that education in a way that they can actually receive it. And so, just a brief example. Again, the 13th Amendment was passed, and then in 1866, there was a Civil Rights Act passed. And then in 1883, I believe it was, the Supreme Court completely ignored the decision in 1866. And so for the next 102 years, there was what they called de jure discrimination, where it was sanctioned by the government, where they created the segregation that we have in this country. And that is true systemic racism. I mean, it was built in the system from the beginning. The law was there. The law just wasn't upheld because you did not have equality in the mindset of those that were making the decision in the Supreme Court at that time. And again, the Supreme Court in 1968 upheld the exact same decision that should have been upheld in 1883. So it's been built into our country, into our system, in every single facet of life. And so we just have to do a good job of educating the public at large at what systemic means, what it looks like, how it came about, and how it impacts us as a whole.
Thank you for that. James, I'd like to ask what your experience is and your opinion of the conversation that's been made popular these days, but specifically by people such as Candace Owens, the Hodge twins. And yes, wait, let me get my face. We'll come back to my opinion on these things, but this talking point has been made a part of the public airwaves by certain people who are really used by white people as figureheads of Black opinion and Black dialogue. Yet I don't run into Black people in everyday life who agree with the Candace Owens of the world. In fact, I've yet to run into one. Even Black conservatives have come out en masse to denounce her recent statements regarding the killings of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd. But with that said, nonetheless, we haven't spoken about this, so I'm genuinely asking in real time, what's your opinion on the drive to deny the existence of systemic racism?
Well, I think one of the best ways to directly acknowledge that is to talk about what we have discussed in our Come Follow Me lesson, not this past week, but the week before, when we studied the teachings of Korohor. For those of you who are joining the conversation and are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, you know about the seductive teachings of Korohor. There are several seductive like one of the reasons that he was so successful in leading people away from the church is because he taught a lot of seductive heresies. And what made them so seductive is that there was a kernel of truth at the heart of every single one of those seductive heresies. For example, one of these seductive heresies out there right now is the moral wrongness of looting and rioting and other forms of violence that may happen at these protests. Many use these occurrences to dismiss the entirety of the Black Lives Matter movement or any kind of fights for civil rights. All of us can like, the thing about that is all of us can concede that these things are wrong generally, and that's the kernel of truth. But in the context of the moment that we find ourselves in right now, it is morally questionable to speak of the violence at these handful of protests out of the thousands of peaceful ones across the country, more than we speak of the hundreds of years of violence perpetuated against the Black body, especially considering that the protests wouldn't even be happening if we dealt properly with the police brutality. You know, there are more of these. There are other seductive heresies out there with kernels of truth. Like the big one I've been hearing the last couple of weeks is that two of the founders of Black Lives Matter organization are Marxists or trained Marxists or something like that. Therefore, the entire organization and therefore the whole movement are Marxists. I also hear the whole black on black crime thing, or my personal favorite, all lives matter. All of these heresies exist and are employed to minimize the severity of the pattern of Black death or deny it entirely at worst. That kind of begs the question of why would anyone want to do that? To get back to your question, Candy, why is it so important to invalidate the plight of Black people who want justice for the crimes against them? Because these heresies justify a low opinion of Black people. They justify an unwillingness to do the difficult work of unlearning harmful ideas and dismantling oppressive structures. And they validate our comfort in a status quo that says Black lives don't matter. It's why you see so many people sharing that Candace Owens video or those Hodge twins videos or Cam Hamilton's status from a couple weeks ago. It's why you see all of these sharings of these videos of Black people denouncing or otherwise invalidating the plight of Black people. These are Black people invalidating or minimizing anti-Black racism. It's like an infinity stone for racists. That's what these Black people who spout off these opinions are. The fundamental source of contention then, particularly between members of the church who support Black Lives Matter and those who don't, seems to be over whether or not Black lives actually matter. And it's quite sad for me as a member of the church to see our people fighting about this. Racialized, state-sanctioned violence without the ability to seek redress, that's something that our pioneer ancestors experienced. That's in our historical DNA. Couple that with the fact that we have the restored gospel of Jesus Christ, that we bear that, the restored gospel of Jesus Christ, who President Nelson told us a month or so back, spent much of his ministry in the margins, the same gospel that tells us that God is no respecter of persons and that all are alike unto God and that there should be an equality among all men. We as Latter-day Saints, we should be the first to say that Black lives matter as we see our Black siblings fail to receive justice again and again. And when we hear them seek redress for these injustices only to fail, just like our pioneer ancestors sought redress only to fail and be exterminated. So like if there's one thing that I want members of the church to understand is that Black Lives Matter is not just consistent with the gospel of Jesus Christ or our message. It is a fundamental tenet of it. And if we can't embrace that, we're never going to be the church that we're supposed to become.
Thank you for that. It's a lot to unpack there. Let me throw out this question, and it's to the entire panel, whoever would like to answer it. What do you say to those who say, but all lives do matter, don't they? So what do you say to that? How do you retort that retort?
I think if we added one word to the title Black Lives Matter, it would put it into perspective. You can say Black Lives Matter also.
Yeah.
Black Lives Matter too, T-O-O. And I think it's really hard for me to, there's just so many examples of things like if somebody says that they have breast cancer and they are concerned about their breast cancer and someone says, hey, well, skin cancer matters too. I saw a funny meme that was going around on July 4th that said, well, to all you patriotic people out there, I'd say happy July 4th, but other countries matter too. And when you think of all these other examples, it's absurd when you consider those things. If somebody's house is on fire and the fire department is putting the water on that house and the neighbors are saying, well, my house matters too, but your house isn't on fire. This house is on fire. It needs some attention, needs some water. And so the whole concept of Black Lives Matter should not be offensive because it's just saying, hey, can we have a little help here? Can you do something? And can you open your voices and your minds to the concept of, of people who have been, have endured a lot and who are now enduring things. Because as far as the police are concerned, this sort of thing has been reported for generations by Black people. This isn't a new thing. It's just that now everybody has a phone with a video camera and a photo, they can take pictures. And so now things are being reported. Will Smith had a really great quote a few weeks ago, right after the George Floyd incident, where he said, racism isn't getting worse, it's just being filmed.
Yeah.
And so Black Lives Matter has been something that Black people have been saying for many, many, many years. But now we have video documentation of what we've been talking about. And so now, like you said, Candy, when people saw for 9 minutes the police officer kneeling on George Floyd's neck, and maybe we were humbled a little bit by the quarantine of the COVID and people were watching their TVs a little bit more and were able to see that sort of thing and say, that's not right. There's something going on here. And so I've noticed personally that it seems like there's been a change. It seems like this George Floyd incident has been different than other ones that we've seen. I've seen more Caucasian people on Facebook that are posting Black Lives Matter, and more people that seem to be understanding for the first time, which is a step in the right direction. But I just think that Black Lives Matter means we matter also, and there's no need for a White Lives Matter, because white lives haven't been treated historically as though they didn't matter. So
okay. Let's get into the statistics, because I know that there are those rather who would want to challenge that and who think, again, that this whole concept of systemic racism is a myth. I want to come back in a moment to ask Josh and Laura, the two members of our panel who are Caucasian. I really want to ask their perspective and to hear if they could maybe give us any insight from their particular points of view as to why there's so much resistance to embracing these points, if it somehow makes white people feel that they aren't being validated. I'm going to ask that question now. Josh, could you speak to why there is such great resistance to even the philosophy? Let's separate the message, Black Lives Matter, from the movement, this particular people involved in the movement. We'll come back to that. I liked what James had to say about the accusations of a Marxist and all the deflections from the actual message. But let's talk about the message. Why do you think there's such resistance on the part of so many people who are non-Black to just being able to say Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's an interesting time in the world. I've been watching both the Black Lives Matter movement and also COVID play out, and I've seen some very perplexing things. So I've been asking myself this question over and over for a while now. I've got a couple ideas, and it's the best I can come up with so far. I'm happy to share. I think the simple answer to your question is really fear. And feeling uncomfortable, the fear of feeling like you don't have all of the answers, the fear of the vulnerability that it requires to be willing to engage in a conversation about something that perhaps doesn't affect you directly, and therefore it's not in your face in your day-to-day, but is affecting somebody else. That's not necessarily a comfortable position to be in, and I think a lot of people shy away from that. And so as I've thought through this issue a little bit, I'm trying to identify what the drivers are that lead to these types of dismissive behaviors, where someone can genuinely and sincerely express the struggle that they're going through to someone else who ought to be in the group of people who shows the most empathy and the most compassion towards their fellow man or fellow woman. And yet so many of the responses are caustic, knee-jerk, conversation-ending reactions to what's been shared as a plea, that it's just head-scratching. And so I think that one of the fundamental needs, or that is a driver for so much of this behavior, is that we all inherently need to feel and want to feel safe. And when our safety or our stability is threatened, then I think people will go to great lengths to nip that in the bud and get back to their state of equilibrium. Okay?
Thank you. Oh, sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
And so what is that equilibrium? Well, I grew up in Boise, Idaho, fairly similar sort of environment and demographic to Salt Lake City. And as I was growing up, as I was observing and being informed for the people around me, family, friends, people at school, teachers, just everybody in the community, I inherited what I will call my default set of beliefs. And I left Boise when I went off to college with that default set of beliefs. I never heard anything racist in my own home. My parents, grandparents, I never heard anything overtly racist. But my grandparents were big Rush Limbaugh fans, and it's a very conservative political environment. So I left with a default set of beliefs that did not set me up well to be empathetic for people that had experiences that were different than mine. So how did I overcome that? Well, I went to school with a lot of people from all over the world, and I took the occasion to interact and meet people that were different than me. And I've traveled all over the world as well. And when you take the opportunity to talk and interact with people who are different, you quickly realize that we're all mostly the same. And we shouldn't be focused on the differences rather than the similarities. And so I think that what's really required of people like me, people who maybe aren't experiencing this stuff firsthand, is to be willing to be uncomfortable enough to have a conversation with someone else who's struggling. And I think that's really what it comes down to. And I don't think, for a variety of reasons, that a lot of people are open to that at this time. And I hope that that's one of the byproducts of this conversation, is that people can realize that there is a conversation to be had and that they can be more willing to engage in it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Laura, what do you think fuels the deep resistance and almost resentment felt, especially in LDS circles, towards the phrase Black Lives Matter, but in the world at large, for those who are uncomfortable with it? What do you think is fueling that?
I think first of all that this really does go back to this idea of fear, that sometimes we have this idea that freedoms and liberties are part of a pie, that if we end up giving them to somebody else, if we end up acknowledging that another group is also as equal or also needs a little bit more of a help up, or more consideration or more empathy, that somehow or another we're taking it away from our own pot. And that's just a fundamental misunderstanding of how things work. Because at the end of the day, it's about everybody being pulled up to be able to share the same things that we have been able to benefit from the entire time. And I grew up in Toronto, which is one of the most multicultural cities in the world. I had friends from all different races and ethnicities and religions and backgrounds. And I took it for granted that these were my friends, and why would I not want to see them be able to have success? That when I moved to the States and then into Utah, where there wasn't the same level of diversity, people weren't having the same opportunities to be able to interact like I had taken for granted growing up. And so sometimes there ends up being that element of fear that somebody is different and how will that look. Another thing that and we've talked a little bit about this, you and I, Candy, but one of my professors was involved, for instance, and this goes back to this idea of even systemic racism. A lot of people like to think that, civil rights, that's all these decades hence, and Blacks have equal rights. And what they fail to understand is that systemic racism is unfortunately alive and well. So one of my professors, like I said, worked on this particular project with a sociolinguist, John Baugh. And John Baugh, who is an African-American who can speak a pretty standard variety of English, as well as speaking African-American vernacular English, as well as also with a Latino Chicano accent. And they actually use the exact same script to call for getting interviews and to be able to see apartments.
Oh.
And John actually, it was the same voice, but he used each of the different varieties with the same script. And what came out every single time was when he sounded white, so when he used that particular voice, he was far more successful at being able to obtain an interview and a viewing for an apartment than when he used either the Chicano or the African-American vernacular English varieties.
Mm-hmm. That brings me to wanting to talk about some real statistics regarding systemic racism, because again, I have seen a real resistance to acknowledging that it still exists. So I wanted to share some information with our audience. But first, are we getting a ton of feedback? I'm hearing an echo. Are we doing okay? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, and in fact, we actually have, Christina has even brought up that the lack of understanding allows for fear and reacting out of fear. And I think she's spot on.
Yes. So I'm going to share this with our audience. Let's talk about why people are still insisting that systemic racism exists in 2020. First, we'll go to the job market. For the past 60 years, this is actually true, despite the economy, despite economic ups and downs, the Black unemployment rate has consistently been twice that of whites for 60 years. Blacks with college degrees are twice as likely to be unemployed as all other graduates from any other racial background. There's a specific study that was done that sounds similar even to your anecdotal point that you brought up, Laura. There was a study done that found that job applicants with white sounding names get called back 50% more often than applicants with stereotypically Black sounding names, even when they had identical resumes, which they used for this study. In 2018, the average Black worker earned 62% of what the average white worker made. Similarly, overall income for all Black Americans in 2018 was 42% lower than that of whites in 2018. While there are about 6 times as many white Americans as Black Americans, the aggregate wealth held by white Americans is 17 times higher than that held by Black Americans. Let's move to education. As early as preschool, race disparities have been noted in preschool-aged children. Black children make up 18% of preschoolers nationwide, but they make up 50% of preschool suspensions. When all age groups are examined, Black students are 3 times more likely to be suspended than white students, even with similar infractions. Overall, Black students represent 16% of student enrollment, yet they are 27% of students referred to law enforcement. And once Black children are in the criminal justice system, they're 18 times more likely than white children to be sentenced as adults. That brings us to talking about the prison population. Blacks are 13% of the overall US population, but represent 40% of the prison population. Let's talk about why that might be. Well, once arrested, Black people are convicted more often than white people. They're about 20% more likely to be sentenced to jail time versus whites. And when they receive sentences for the same crimes, they are 20%, the sentences are 20% longer for Blacks than those for whites convicted of similar crimes, according to and again, I will provide links when I re-air this broadcast on YouTube. I'll provide links to the various studies that are being cited, okay, because they come from all different sources. I will say that I appreciate the fact that many businesses have come forward at this time to talk about racial disparity and to provide information. And one that I found that was extremely useful that I want to give a shout out to is Ben & Jerry's. I love your vegan flavors. And they have a whole page on systemic racism, and they've cited a bunch of different studies. And so if you're looking for more information, you can go there in the meantime. But anyway, according to the Sentencing Project, Black Americans are much more likely to get arrested on drug charges than white Americans, even though usage rates of drugs between Blacks and whites are quite comparable. Once arrested, Black defendants are more likely than white defendants to be denied bail. They're more likely to receive harsher sentences than white defendants. And of course, that brings us to the conversation and the hot button topic right now of fatal police shootings. So many of you may or may not know that the Washington Post has been compiling a database of all US citizens who are fatally shot by police since 2015. And what it has found is that 2,469 white people have been fatally shot. Since 2015, 1,293 Black people have been fatally shot. The rate for white people is 13 people per million. For Blacks, it's 31 per million. Blacks are almost 3 times as likely to be shot and killed by police as white people. Also, I want to point out, because a lot of people have cited that database collection by the Washington Post, please be aware that it only compiles shootings, fatal shootings of people killed by police. So someone like George Floyd, Eric Garner, people who were killed by illegal chokeholds, Freddie Gray, these are not included in the database, but someone who's a serial killer, for instance, would be included in that database. Omar Mateen, who was the mass shooter who killed 49 people in the Orlando nightclub in 2016, is included in that database, but not men like George Floyd. So keep that in mind. Let's talk about police fatal shootings of unarmed suspects. That list compiles that there have been 352 instances since 2015 of American citizens who were shot fatally by police. 145 of them were white. 123 of them were Black. So 22 less Black people than white people, except white people are 72% of the population. Black people are 13%. Blacks are disproportionately being killed by police. The statistics are consistent and they're very clear. That breaks down into a rate of 10.7 white deaths per 10 million people of unarmed suspect and 30.1 Black deaths per 10 million people. So again, the rate is almost 3 times as high. You're almost 3 times as likely as a Black person in this country to be killed. In the 18 to 19 group, Black people are nearly 13 times more likely to be killed than their white counterparts. Let's talk about substance abuse. Again, marijuana, something that has been legalized now in many parts of the country, and the usage rates are almost identical for whites and Blacks, yet the racial disparity in arrests is astounding. Let's see, it's Black Americans, when it comes to even marijuana rates, are 3.64 times more likely to be arrested for that. Let's talk about housing. Many of you might be familiar with the term redlining. It's basically a practice where lenders created maps and outlined them in red for districts that were deemed undesirable. First started happening in the 1930s, but the ramifications of it can be felt today. So these districts that were deemed racially and therefore economically undesirable or more risky were denied mortgage loans. And even as Marvin brought up at the top of this conversation, even when that became illegal on paper, these communities were still feeling the effects of decades of being on the fringes of mortgage loan opportunities, which brought down their property values. Property values are what determines local taxes, which support local schools. So redlining has had a huge impact on the Black community. Look it up if you're not more familiar with it. Currently, in this racial climate, Black home ownership is at an all-time low in the past 50 years in this country as we speak. 42% of Blacks currently own homes compared to 72% of white people. Finally, in terms of the conversation of systemic racism, it would be incomplete if we didn't talk about healthcare. A 2012 study found that 67% of doctors have an unconscious racial bias against African-American patients. According to the CDC, Black mothers in the US die at 3 to 4 times the rate of white mothers in childbirth and during or soon thereafter. In terms of, I lost my place, so forgive me, but in terms of, I want to say pregnancy mortality rates. And put another way, a Black woman is 22% more likely to die from heart disease than a white woman, 71% more likely to perish from cervical cancer if you're a Black woman versus a white woman, and 243% more likely to die from pregnancy or child-related causes. This is a real problem in this country. So when people are hell-bent on denying the existence of systemic racism amidst all of these facts, which anyone can go research for yourself, it's quite shocking to me, but I've said enough. How do you feel? Anyone, feel free to jump in.
Well, and Candy, really quickly, I mean, we're in a pandemic right now where Blacks are being disproportionately infected and hospitalized and are dying. And this is also linked to the fact that their employment is more likely to put them into the service industry, to be able to have them in more of harm's way. You're less likely to have the sort of level because of that sort of employment to be able to have the coverage. It's the fact that we might have equal rights on paper does not necessarily mean that in practical terms there is actually equality. And just going back, Patrick, I think you mentioned about the "Come Follow Me" in the scriptures, and James, I think you brought some of this up too, right? And what I find really fascinating is how many times over the last little bit in the Book of Mormon, where we've been actually talking about that prosperity in the land is contingent upon equality. And the Book of Mormon is so full of those sorts of things. And we don't have real equality, that we are seeing a lack of equal prosperity across this country. Anyway, just want to throw that out.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So James, can you give your opinion or speak a little bit more as to why you think there's such a drive to toss aside the concept of ongoing racism and to say that people who want to remedy this problem are playing the victim?
Okay. This is a bit of a difficult thing for me to talk about, simply because anytime somebody wants to suggest that Black people are playing the victim, I come from 2 parents who were brought up in the Jim Crow South. And I think anybody who had Black parents who grew up during that particular time, we've always been told, and they've always been told, and they passed this information down to us, you got to be twice as good to get what they have. Yeah. Victimization and its variants have long been used to discourage dialogue and dismiss words like mine, words like yours, Candy, words like Black people's in general. The possibility that Black folk might adopt a victim mentality and their commitment to self-help be vitiated, as you're implying, it's a whole mess. That argument is problematic for a few reasons. This idea of victimization or encouraging victimization by talking about racism. The first thing it does is it presumes that Black folk are too stupid to already know what they're experiencing. That's like the first thing. Those like people who espouse white supremacy in particular, who bemoan the so-called victim mindset, they appear to believe that no one would think about racism were it not for the constant presence of liberals and leftists raising the issue. Secondly, the argument supposes that Black folks are so weak-willed that if they really understood the obstacles that were in their way, they would just like disappear like cotton candy in water. You know what I'm saying? As such, the fact that prominent Black conservatives like Candace Owens or the Hodge twins that you brought up are among the most outspoken proponents of this particular argument of the victim mentality, that discussing racism risks the inculcation, I think I'm using that word right, of a permanent victim mentality. It suggests how very little they think of their own racial group. Their agreement with any white person that espouses white supremacy does not justify any kind of pushback against white supremacy. Like, the truth is, Black folk, we have always been well aware of the negative stereotypes held about our racial group from like an early age. I knew when I was 5, you know, and my parents had that talk with me when I was about 5. There's evidence that indicates an awareness of these stereotypes as soon as the 3rd grade, and rarely later than the 5th. Around the age of like 11, I was aware for a long time. This awareness is not due to liberals bringing it up or some ideology. Like, that's not how I learned about racism, but rather the result of Black and brown folks living with the mistreatment that stems from the stereotypes and being exposed to them in media and elsewhere has been found to dramatically impact academic performance. Like, that was a big deal for me, like going through middle school. Even and especially among highly capable and motivated Black students, not to toot my own horn, but like myself, the fear of living down to a stereotype has been shown to generate such anxiety, and I still experience this to this day, that it can suppress performance relative to ability, thereby perpetuating the very performance gaps that feed the stereotypes about Black intelligence in the first place. In other words, whether or not white racism is discussed, the knowledge of its existence is sufficient to negatively impact Black and brown success. Like I said before, talking about racism is not the problem. It's never been the problem, simply talking about racism. Actual racism is the problem. We don't tell Jewish folks to get over the Holocaust or not to talk about those unsavory matters, lest they cripple themselves under the weight of a victim mentality. Has anyone suggested that teaching the Diary of Anne Frank might be debilitating to Jewish children? Do you think to warn any crime victims of the victim mindset after they experience such trauma? So, like, to discuss racism and discrimination is to prepare for its possibility, even while working to overcome its sting. My parents taught me this from a very young age. There's no logic to the belief, having been forewarned, that one must of necessity shrivel up in fear or slack off, convinced that one hasn't had a chance to succeed. Black history makes that case convincingly. My own parents, I'll bring them up again, family first and trailblazers in their own right. They were told that they needed to be twice as good as white folks, like many other Black folks of their day. And I can guarantee you the majority of Black folks today, or at least their parents, have heard some version of this. And why is that? Like, the whole reason is because the system was so profoundly unjust and discrimination so deeply ingrained that despite their best efforts and talent, they would too often be overlooked for the best opportunities solely based on the color of their skin. There's no evidence that being told such a thing would make us try less hard or be injured in any way. No evidence. If anything, the opposite is true. Knowing the odds, like my parents did, they worked even harder because doing otherwise would all but guarantee defeat. So the claim that discussing racism and discrimination turns Black folk into passive victims simply flies in the face of every bit of empirical evidence on the subject. And you do well to leave such arguments alone. That we need any such a thing explained to us is just further evidence of how unqualified the people that bring this particular conversation to the discussion are to have it. But this is what whiteness does. It always seeks superiority over enlightenment, as evidenced by anybody who brings such a conversation to the thread. Because again, there's no empirical evidence to support such an idea that victimization is a valid argument.
I appreciate that. Well, in terms of evidence, I want to bring up a conversation that I had recently with a white member of our church. His example that he wanted to use for stating that systemic racism in our current society is a myth is the fact that there are Black professionals who have made it. There are Black judges at this point. There are Black doctors. There are a few members of the upper echelon of corporate America, and less than 5%, but those exist. And so his argument was, if it's true that it exists for anyone, then it can exist for everyone. I countered that by saying, in terms of, we were talking about my parents specifically, because they were able to achieve a certain level of professional achievement, of clout. It was symptomatic of the fact that they, what you just said, had to work, I would say, more than twice as hard. My mother was the first in her field and the only in her class in law school. She had to be 10 times better than her closest, especially white male counterpart, in an era when Black people were literally prohibited from entering our temples. When my mother graduated law school, we were literally banned from the priesthood, a subject that Marvin Perkins has dedicated the last 20 years to unpacking. But I still want to bring attention to the fact that this is a very real viewpoint that people have, that if there are these Black superstars who have made it in entertainment, athletic stars who are at the top of the field in sports. Can you hear me okay? Okay, so if there's a small percentage of people who have made it, isn't that evidence that there are no longer racial barriers holding us back? Which is why I just went through all the statistics that I went through to counter those. But what do you say to someone who, like a Candace Owens, or a proponent of hers, who feels strongly that it's a myth that there is a challenge to equality that still exists today in 2020, in the era of George Floyd protests and police brutality that many are protesting against?
Sure. Let me jump in and add a little something to the conversation here. First of all, you've got to realize there's going to be opposition in all things. I mean, there really is. And so when there is first of all, we can't be too frustrated that it's there, but we have to use it to our advantage. We've got to be able to use opposition to help understand where we might need to dig a little deeper to educate those that haven't quite made a decision on which way they want to go. We have to be able to be prepared in understanding opposition, understanding where we need to place our focus, and then we can simply move forward in a stronger way. So again, the voice of Candace Owens, yeah, you got me so bothered that I'm going to get up off my butt and I'm going to do something. It's very motivational. And as we were talking about, and I don't want to take the example away, Candy, that we were talking about earlier, but you might want to share your example that we talked about when it comes to opposition and what that does. And I think that's very necessary I think it's very necessary to create the change that we need. We need inspired and fired up people, and opposition can sometimes do that.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. One thing that I think maybe is missing from the conversation often is the recognition that this is a very real challenge and fear that the average Black person in this country carries with him or her. So, for instance, I was having a conversation with Josh recently where he said to me that the fear that I personally have of being pulled over by police and possibly ending up dead, I think, so let me first frame it by saying this. When I'm driving, I genuinely have a fear that if I see a police officer, I could get pulled over for no reason or for a valid reason. I could have a headlight out that I'm not aware of, as an example. And that when I get pulled over, I have a fear that if he has the wrong perception of me, or if I say or do the wrong thing, and I've been pulled over so many times I've stopped counting. It's been more than 20. More than 20 times with me being pulled over for no reason, but I'll come back to that. But I have a very visceral fear that if that police officer decided to shoot and kill me, that he could get off with impunity, especially before recent events where police brutality has been highlighted so much around the world. And Josh was saying to me that for him, as a white person living in America, that fear has never even occurred to him. It never even crossed his mind when he's been pulled over by a police officer that he might end up dead. He's not a criminal. You know, I'm not a criminal. So for him, it's not a reality. And that for our white brothers and sisters, they might be missing that we actually operate with a genuine fear that could happen to us. Josh, would you say that that's true right now, that you still feel that that's not a fear that you can relate to?
Yeah, no, not at all. Not in a million years. In fact, there was one summer in my 20s when I got pulled over 6 times in 3 months. So that's about every 2 weeks. Not once did it ever occur to me that I was in any sort of physical danger. I was a little rowdy back then, so I cursed out a police officer without any concern that it could go sideways. It just never occurred to me. And so this is a different experience. And so again, if I'm not willing to listen to a genuine difference in your experience from mine, then how can I help make the problem better?
So what do we think about Blue Lives Matter and that movement that has grown in response to the Black Lives Matter movement, and that movement from which many people would say was necessitated from a genuine fear that cops were being wrongfully targeted? Who would like to speak to that? Patrick, would you like to speak to that?
Yes. Sure. This isn't a complicated thing for me. There's good cops, lots of them, probably the majority of them, and they should be respected. They should be looked up to. And there's bad cops, and they should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. You can go back to what we were talking about earlier about the protests that have been going on. There's been lots and lots of peaceful protesters. They should be respected. They should be heard. They should be acknowledged and validated. And the people that are doing the rioting and the looting, those are not good people. They should be prosecuted, identified, and whatever the law requires, it should be applied to those people. So,
what about, may I break in and say, I agree with you on that point. Although one thing that was very upsetting for me that I observed during peaceful protests was peaceful protesters being gassed by police, having rubber bullets thrown at them, lodged at them. What do you call it? Shot at them. I've seen newscasters arrested while reporting on protests live on the air. I've seen a lot of things that seem to go counter to the very fundamentals of our American legal system and our American ideology. And so you're saying you feel that protesters should be, rioters, people who are breaking the law,
right,
should be dealt with. What about the police who are exhibiting so much police brutality at anti-police brutality protests?
Yeah, address that. I believe that there's mostly good cops, and the good cops should be respected. And the ones that are not, that are abusing their power in whatever way it is, whether it's shooting people with rubber bullets when they shouldn't be, or gassing them, or having their knee on somebody's neck, then they should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law, just like I would expect to be if I did any of those things.
Thank you.
So,
I'm sorry. Did you want to say something? Thank you. Marvin, what do you say about Blue Lives Matter?
Well, first of all, again, I echo Patrick's comments, and it's a difficult job, right? It's a very difficult job. I wouldn't want anybody shooting at me. I wouldn't want to carry a gun going to work. I know that because of the nature of the work, there is trauma, and where there's trauma, there is a traumatic stress. And so I know that several police officers experience post-traumatic stress, and it's just a difficult situation. However, I think part of this conversation has to focus on, the systemic nature of the problem. Like, for an example, there is a term used by police departments in our nation, and it's called NHI. And NHI stands for no human involved. And so why would we be referencing human beings as not even human? And so if that has made it into the police department, that's a problem if we're not even acknowledging people as human beings. You also have a situation, let's go back to George Floyd. The officer who murdered George Floyd had 15 complaints, and none of those 15, I'm sorry, 18. Okay, even better. And basically, what he really had was slaps on the wrist. And so basically, there was a department that told him that you can go out and do whatever you want to, and we've got your back. That's the problem. It conditioned him to believe, and he sat there knowing that he was being filmed, and just like it didn't matter. It really just didn't matter. So that system that he works in told him that he could actually go out and do that. I was just in New York recently visiting a friend, and he said that one of our old buddies went to work for the police department. And he said he quit that job and went back to work for a factory. He said, I can't become what they want me to become. So there was a system that turned his system off that he just couldn't be a part of. So the other guy that was, again, of the 4 officers there killing George Floyd, you only needed one of them to say, hey, get off of his neck, get him up, let's get him in the car. The other officer, the other more experienced officer, he had over 6 complaints. And again, nothing but slaps on the wrist, one lawsuit where he just stopped and harassed an African-American man walking down the street with his pregnant girlfriend of European descent. And he's beating him up in handcuffs. And so they were told that you can go and do whatever you want to this group of people, and we've got your back. Nothing's going to happen. That's the problem that needs to be fixed. And if we can fix that problem, then we can address some of those other problems as well. But, do Blue Lives Matter? They absolutely do. Are there concerns that need to be addressed? Absolutely. But this one is a valid concern, and it needs to be addressed as well.
Thank you. So where do we go from there? We're having a little bit of sound feedback problems. Can you hear me okay now? Yes. Okay. Where do we go from here? We have people who are pro-Black and feel that racism is still alive and well, and not enough people are speaking out against it. We have people who are pro-cops and feel that cops are being wrongfully targeted and disrespected. We have a church body of people who seem to be talking at each other instead of to each other. What's the solution? Marvin, I'll pose this first to you, and then we'll go around the panel. What would you like to see happening in the next year, 5 years, 8 years from now?
Well, first of all, one thing that has been taboo in the past was having a conversation about it. And so the first thing we got to do is we got to be able to talk about it. Secondly, I want to just really tip my hat off to the youth of not only of America, but the youth of the world who's getting out there leading these protests, making them happen, and youth of all cultures and people of all cultures that are basically saying, hey, this is enough. And so there are some of us that have been doing this work for a lifetime, and will continue doing it for a lifetime, because it is a lifetime work. This is not a temporary thing that we're gonna, get into. I remember the time when I was involved in Black Lives Matter. No, this is something that is to be continued until there is no problem. I pushed out something the other day that said, again, when all human beings are treated with the same reverence of the American flag, then you will no longer see a protest of the American flag. And so it's a simple concept. Mm-hmm. It's a simple concept, but not everybody understands simplicity. So we have to keep working. We've got to keep the conversations going. We got to remember it's a lifetime work. Everybody's opinion matters. And we have to just love and respect each other in a way where we can share openly and come up with some conclusions together.
Thank you. James, where do we go from here?
if you remember nothing else from me about this particular subject, I'm just going to lead with, first of all, listen to Black women. That's a big deal. Listen to Black people in general, because if anyone knows what it's like to be Black in America, it's Black people. They're the experts on it. I have 3 decades in this body. I basically have 3 doctorates in being Black in America. And it's not hard to listen to people who have more experience being Black in America than you do. Like, that's not a hard thing to do. It's not just more experience, but it's also more education. We let our doctors cut us open and prescribe toxins to put in our bodies. We trust 8 hours of the education and care of our children to adults we don't even know. But we can't believe the 86% of Black people who support this movement when they tell us what their experiences in this country are. If you haven't experienced racism, good for you, but just because something is not a reality for you, it doesn't mean it's not a reality. It's not a reality, period.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
It's not a reality to everybody else.
Yeah, it's not a reality to everybody else. I look at the people in our own community that are experts in this field, people who have put in time in both being Black people and also, having relative experience. I think about people like my sister. I think about Dr. LaShawn Williams. I think about Dr. Reverend Fatima Saleh. I think about Dr. Misha McGriggs, Dr. Kimberly Applewhite, who I'm pretty sure is here right now. We have our own Black Mormon intelligentsia, people who not only have the experience being Black, but also the education. And I will listen to them far more often than I will listen to somebody who just watched a YouTube video that says Black Lives Matter are Marxists. You know what I'm saying? I agree with Marvin that everybody's opinion matters, but I am going to push back just a little bit in saying that not every opinion matters as much. I'm going to listen to as much as another. I am going to listen to a doctor far more likely than I'm going to listen to somebody who watched the pandemic. You know what I'm saying? I'm going to put my trust and my faith in people who have the experience and who have the education on how we move forward. I'm going to listen to Ibram X. Kendi. I'm going to listen to Michelle Alexander. I'm going to listen to W.B. Du Bois. I'm going to listen to James Baldwin long before I listen to the likes of the Hodge twins or Candace Owens or people who are literally for sale. So I think the way forward is that we listen to Black people and we believe them. If we, like, Black people have always been right about this stuff. When it comes to whether or not racism has existed, back when slavery was still a thing, that may have been the quote unquote norm at that time, but do you know who knew it was wrong? Black people knew it was wrong back then. When racism morphed into something more socially acceptable, like Jim Crow, like, Black people still knew that was wrong too. Black people knew every time. When it morphed to something yet more socially acceptable, somebody's already talked about this. When it morphed into redlining, when it morphed into mass incarceration and police brutality, again, Black people knew and still know that that mess is wrong. So I think we can save ourselves a lot of trouble if we just listen to Black folks, especially those who have put in the time, those who have the experience, and those who have the education. I think if we can follow their lead and work against white supremacy on Black people's terms, rather than trying to do that on our own, I think we'll be in a much better place.
Thank you. I appreciate that. You bring up a point that I very much want to speak to, and that is the Candace Owens Hodge twins point of view. Their argument is just, I'm having people send me videos of them constantly, especially white LDS people. And one thing that I have said that I think is a fair statement about it is that in my own personal anecdotal experience, I have yet to meet a Black person in real life who is in agreement with what they're espousing. I'm sure they exist somewhere, I just don't know them. And I'm a member of a myriad of different groups that are for Black people. So everything from Black Latter-day Saints to racial equality, to groups of hundreds of thousands. I think there are 800,000 Black people now in the Blackout Coalition, all kinds of groups. Black Lives Matter groups, Black social justice groups. I have yet to come across someone in real life who is a proponent of the things that Candace Owens is saying, yet I have met very many white people who are proponents of what she's saying. So what does that tell you, and I just want to offer an analogy with all due love and respect, that if someone were to speak for the Mormon church, who 90+% of Mormons disagreed with, yet someone from the Baptist church made that person the figurehead for Mormon thought, it would be very distressing for Mormons, and it would be unfair. It's unfair to put someone on a platform and make them the sort of leader of the conversation for a group of people when that group of people doesn't agree with them. So I'm not saying, I would never make a blanket statement against a Candace Owens or anybody else, because for me, this isn't political. My views are actually, I have views that are not, you can't put me in any extreme position, period, right? I see the merits of all different political perspectives. And like I said, this isn't a conversation about politics, this is one about spirituality. But for me, it's not a political difference that I have with these people that bothers me. It's an anti-Black fundamental point of view. And so when Black people are pushing back and saying, no, she doesn't speak for us, I hope that white people can consider that it's unfair to discount the opinion and the experience of the Black person you actually know, your neighbor, the person on your timeline, because I'm like the one Black friend of probably, hundreds of Mormons, or, one in less than 5. And so they're sending me videos of someone that they saw posted on YouTube, but they're not wanting to listen or hear my perspective or Patrick's perspective or Marvin or you, James, or people that they know personally or that they're in touch with. And I just find that to be an odd thing. So I would just, if I could give one bit of advice to my non-Black brothers and sisters, I would say, how about having a conversation with your Black friends in real life and listening to and validating their experiences versus seeking out someone you don't know. You don't know what their agenda is. You don't know if they're paid or not paid or what they're being influenced by. But how about listening to and connecting with the people you do know? Laura, what do you think about that opinion and perspective? I know you've been sent her videos as well.
As a white girl, can I just tell you one of the most irritating things is when I see other white members of the church who will see a video from someone like a Candace Owens, and because it seems to fit with the narrative and does not challenge them to change, they embrace it. And they embrace it at the expense of listening, and it actually allows them to be able to get away without having to have a very difficult conversation, which is going to force them to have to face things that are not going to be comfortable. But those conversations are the very things that we need to be doing to be able to build the bridges and to be able to heal and to be able to create communities in our wards and in our stakes. And I mean, for heaven's sakes, even within Utah, even, just in our local communities. So as long as we keep espousing the voices that are convenient to us and then discounting everybody else, we are doing a tremendous amount of disservice to the people who are in our faith, who are feeling like they might not have a place, or that they aren't as valued, or that somehow or another their voices, it essentially shuts down their voice. And I keep going back to this idea, right, that if we're supposed to bear one another's burdens and we're supposed to mourn with those who mourn, we can't do that when we fail to actually listen to the individuals who are living across the street from us or next door to us, or working with us. Everything starts with just shutting up and humbling ourselves and finally listening and asking questions that are going to be really uncomfortable, and to be willing to listen and to learn, and to be not listening to have a defense and to try to defend yourself as a white person, but to simply listen, to be able to learn and to have a change of heart, to be able to understand how we can be better supports to one another. That's the only thing that's going to allow us to really be able to build communities and to be able to establish good relationships with one another and to be able to love our neighbor. Loving our neighbor means putting off our own ideas and to be able to listen to what the heart and the experience of the person in front of us is. And that takes a lot of humility, to be able to admit that maybe we've been wrong, that we've had biases and misunderstandings about a group of people that we didn't have a lot of experience with. And we can't be waiting, for our friends who from the Black community to reach out to us, that we need to be reaching out to them. And I find it really interesting. Nobody wants to be called a racist, right? But I think we're at a point where it's not good enough to not just be a racist, but that we need to be working together to become anti-racist, to be able to eliminate this sort of thinking and this sort of bias, and to accept the fact that we're going to fall down at times. And that's why we establish our friendships with people who can help give us course correction so that we can end up moving forward together.
I appreciate that. Josh, where do we go from here?
Yeah, that's the big question. I talked before about this concept of a default belief system that we all travel through the world with until something in our life or our choice gives us an opportunity to update the concept of having to get your own testimony. And the idea is that you probably are very influenced. Your default testimony was built on your family, your friends, whoever your influencers were. But at some point, that's not going to be good enough. And you need to do the work to be able to ask God to be able to find out for yourself what you're going to believe as far as your religious beliefs. And I would propose that it should not end there, and that we should follow that same pattern. Sincere questioning, of being willing to step out into the unknown, to be able to go through the other beliefs that we have that we may not have even evaluated or thought about. We just accept them and use them, and they influence our lives and our perceptions. We all need to take occasion to go through all of these different beliefs and challenge them and do the work. The whole faith began with these types of questions. Joseph Smith in James 1:5, he lacked wisdom, and so he asked God. He took it seriously. He went through the effort, and look what became of it. And so we just need to be willing to acknowledge that we don't have all the answers, even if we would like to think we do, and just to be open to learning. And I think that's really what it comes down to. And a lot of people aren't going to be that way because it's uncomfortable, but we have to.
Thank you. Pactrick, where do we go from here? You've been the subject of lots of racism in your life, lots of ignorance, lots of pushing back against ideas that you were trying to share to forward the cause, and yet you still remain steadfast in your testimony. I'm often inspired by how strong you are and dedicated. How do you do that? What advice would you give for others who are just struggling with testimony right now?
Okay.
And where do we go from here?
I have a few closing remarks. To answer your first question right there about what do you do to stay strong, stay on the path, that's explained in the first chapter of Nephi in Lehi's dream. The people who made it to the tree of life were people who clung to the rod of iron. It's the only way to make it to receive the full love of God, is to grab onto that rod of iron, which we know is the word of God, and to just go hand over hand and never let go of it. The way I picture that particular story is the rod is in between the path and the midst of darkness, and the great chasm that leads to the great and spacious building. So I've personally read the Book of Mormon 70 times, 70. I love the book. It's my secret weapon as far as staying spiritual. I haven't missed a day since 1993. And in all those days since 1993, I've made lots of great choices, lots of bad choices. But every day there was one good choice that I made, and that was reading the Book of Mormon. As far as where do we go from here, I definitely echo what James said. Don't dismiss Black people when we have something to say, when we're it's painful to talk about these things sometimes. And I have a lot of LDS friends who are mostly white, and I know they love me, and I know that they care about me. And sometimes even from them, I feel dismissed when I share racial experiences that I have had in the church, and that can be extremely frustrating. You asked a question a few seconds ago about Candace Owens and why do white people embrace what she has to say. Well, like I just said, it's difficult and it's painful and it's hard to deal with these sorts of things. So if you have somebody that just presents some simple solution, then you don't have to do anything. You can just say, oh, well, the problem doesn't even exist, and they're just playing the victims, and they're just, making something out of something that isn't real. And as a Black member of the church, I tell you that is unbelievably frustrating. It's really frustrating to when people say there's no such thing as white privilege. I just want to touch on that. This is a touchy subject, I know, for a lot of white people, but white privilege does not mean that your life isn't difficult. It doesn't mean that your life isn't hard. It doesn't mean that you didn't have to work to get your degree. It doesn't mean that you didn't have challenges in your life and that you struggled with things. What it means is that your life isn't hard because of the color of your skin. That's really what white privilege is all about. Is you get to, like Josh was saying there, he gets pulled over by police. It doesn't even occur to him that this could end badly. That's an example of white privilege. At the end of the day, I'm reminded of the sons of Mosiah who wanted to go and preach to the Lamanites. And the Lamanites despised the Nephites, and the Nephites at that time despised the Lamanites, but the sons of Mosiah had this unbelievable love for those people. And just the thought of even one of their souls being lost was just too much for them. They ended up being missionaries for 14 years among the Lamanites, and they had so much success that at the end of their mission, Ammon was completely overcome with joy. He couldn't even stand up. He was so full of joy when he considered all the blessings that the Lord had done for them. So as members of the church, I think we need to adopt a little bit more of the sons of Mosiah's love attitude and just love people that are different. See people the way the Savior does. As members of the church, that's our mandate. That's what we're supposed to do. We are supposed to be the salt of the earth. We're supposed to be the best that the Lord has, aren't we? We're supposed to be the people that are leading the world in the example of how to be like the Savior. Now, having said that, the most difficult thing to do is to forgive people while they are literally, or in our case, metaphorically, nailing you to a cross. Think about that for a second. In the moment, while it was happening, the Savior was forgiving these soldiers while they were nailing him to the cross. Now, we're not going to be nailed to crosses, but we have metaphoric crosses that we're nailed to in life. So on our end, it's also having the love of Christ. I'm going to just share one last story. It was a unique experience being a missionary in the late 80s and being Black and being in Utah. I think the only Black people that they had ever seen were me and like Carl Malone or something. And so it was, for all my companions, I'm sure that they would agree, they just got a little bit of a different amount of attention when I was their companion. So my entire mission, I would have people come up to me and they would say things like, oh, I had a nephew and he went to Nigeria on his mission. And I'm thinking, I'm from Washington, D.C. What do I have to do with Nigeria? And so, I had a Black friend once, and my sister adopted a Black kid. I would get this my entire mission. And it was very frustrating to me because I came from Washington, D.C., area where there's people of color of every kind of the rainbow. And then my first area was Evanston, Wyoming, that I was plunked into. And so in the late 80s, being in Utah as a missionary was a novelty. And so I actually learned some things because I would get offended a little bit when people would say, what are you? Or where are you from? And I got this my entire mission. And towards the end of my mission, I had a really powerful experience. When you're a missionary in Utah, you often have the opportunity to meet some general authorities. And I actually had dinner with a couple of apostles, and I'd met a number of general authorities. And one of the ones that I met was Neil A. Maxwell. And he was, at that time, my favorite apostle. And he was speaking at university in Ogden. Is it Heber? I think it's called Heber University. And he was speaking at Pioneers Day, and he was talking about the saints and how they come across for the pioneers. And I was able to meet him after after his talk. And my companion and I went up to him, and he reads my name tag, it's Elder McKinley. He comes and he grabs me by both hands, and he starts saying to me, I was just in Kenya, Elder. And he starts telling me about the saints in Africa. So this is nearly...
Friends, you don't have to associate us.
No, I'm just saying, this was Neil A. Maxwell, apostle of the church. And he was my favorite apostle. He didn't stop being my favorite apostle. I reflected and looked in the mirror a little bit and thought, okay, maybe I'm being a little too harsh. Maybe because I'm from Washington, D.C., and this is such an unusual thing for people to come up to me and ask me, what are you? Maybe I need to cut people a little slack. Maybe they are just trying to connect with me because maybe, like you said, Candy, you're the first Black experience, certainly the first Black LDS experience for how many people? Countless of them, I'm sure. So from that point forward, I started cutting people a lot more slack when Neil A. Maxwell came up to me and said that to me. And I continued to love him. He was my favorite apostle up until the time that he died. My favorite one now is Elder Holland, which is probably what most of us would say. But, you know, at the end of the day, just open your hearts and be a disciple of Christ, which is what we are mandated to do. It's as simple as that. If we really love the Savior and we're trying to do the things that please the Father, then we're going to look at our brothers and sisters, hopefully a little bit more the way they see us.
Thank you. I mean, is there anything that we could say that's more meaningful or impactful than be a disciple of Christ? That's what we're all here for. I think we have time for like one or two questions from the audience. So really quickly, I just wanted to cover these. Nikki Woofenden, hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, wrote, when is it appropriate for me as a white person to step in as an ally, and when is it not appropriate? I worry about centering myself or being a white savior. Does anyone have an answer for Algie or Nikki?
I have a quick one. You made covenants to be an example of Christ at all times and in all places. And so just honor those covenants all the time.
Thank you. I wrote a brief response on the event page, and I'll reiterate it for anyone who didn't see it. I think that if we are coming from a place of being heart-centered and not ego-centered, then anything that we do with sincerity from our hearts will be received as such. And we needn't worry about if it's the exact politically correct right thing to do. I think what's more important for us to concern ourselves with is just sincerely wanting to be a part of the solution. And so
okay, Katie.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. This has come up so many times that I've got to throw it in right now. I think part of the biggest opportunity that's in the church is to, and somebody covered this earlier, is to do a transplant. There has to be a testimony transplant. Too many people have cultural testimonies that are built on following brethren instead of following the Savior. And so you have the attributes of man and you don't have the attributes of Christ. As soon as you have the attributes of Christ, this is a simple conversation. This is not difficult. And so convert to Jesus Christ and convert those cultural testimonies over to spiritual testimonies, and this work is a lot easier.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Follow your heart. Okay, another question that came in was from Craig Talbot, and he says, what can we do when we're in congregations with little diversity to make things better? Anyone? I know it's a hard one because our congregations are not diverse more than 90% of the time.
I actually do have an answer to that. I think if white people are in a situation where other white people are, for example, making racial jokes, I think that that's an opportunity for you to say, hey, that's not funny. That's not appropriate. Because most racial jokes start off like this. People look around to see who's there so that they can tell the joke to make sure they're not going to offend somebody within earshot. So if there are white people who are hearing things like that, stand up, say something, say when you think that it's not appropriate. And you don't have to do it in a contentious way, but that's one way to start the change.
Thank you.
Also education. I mean, you have to learn the truths. As a Latter-day Saint, there's a long, well-documented history of racism. And it's still confusion in the scriptures that people are talking about every single day. So it's really simple to just go and learn the truths relative to these things and then teach them frequently. Teach them for as long as the false doctrines have been taught, and longer, until they're just rooted out of the entire church system. But the easiest way is to learn truths and teach them in your congregations, in the gospel doctrine classes, in the priesthood and relief society classes. Make sure they're happening in the sacrament meetings. Learn and teach truth relative to this issue. It will help the problem in a very vast way.
Thank you. Laura, is there anything you'd like to say in closing to that? How do we combat the lack of diversity in our church buildings, in our wards, in our communities?
So,
Good question.
yeah, when I first got to BYU a number of years ago, I happened to have some Black students who were walking just a little bit behind me, and I overheard the conversation, and they were saying, "Oh my gosh, I think we might be the only Black kids on campus." And I turned to them and I said, "I'm from Toronto, and I'm wondering, this is like super, super white." And they started to laugh, because they're going, "Oh my gosh, you get it." And I think every single time that we hear comments that a lot of times come from, like, they're well-meaning, and they come from a place of just ignorance and lack of experience. And when we take the opportunity to correct those and to stand up for people who might not be part of our congregations but are part of our faith, then we go a long way with trying to help people remember that there are people from all different backgrounds who are part of our faith, who, even if they're not immediately represented, they do exist. And the more that we can change the way that we think to become more inclusive. And you know, I've been teaching Sunday school via Zoom every week since church got officially canceled. And one of the things that I have really loved is the fact that every single Sunday we focus on Christ. And it doesn't matter whether or not people are married or single or have experience with outside of this country or inside. The fact is that when we end up focusing on Christ, and this goes back, I think Marvin, you said this, right? When we focus and put our anchor on Christ, and that's where our testimony is built, and we remember that we are supposed to be advocates for one another. We're supposed to be loving one another, and there are no caveats. It's not love the people who are like you. It's love everybody. It becomes a lot easier when we start to see the divinity of all people, and that we stand up against any comments that betray that divinity in our wards, in our meeting houses, and even our conversations.
Thank you. I appreciate that. James, lack of diversity in our wards. How do we make things better?
You know, it's been said a couple of different ways. I'm going to try to say something relatively succinct to this particular point, but something that I make a regular effort to do on my podcast called Beyond the Block is to make sure that people are able to see themselves in the text, make sure people are able to see how their particular population or how their people can be spoken to using our sacred text, using the Book of Mormon, using the Bible. I always make an effort to read intention for marginalized people into the gospel, particularly in a church such as ours, where people that look like me are not conditioned to. I grew up in a time where people were regularly using and weaponizing the sacred texts to tell me and my family that we were cursed or that we were less righteous in a previous existence. And they were using the history of our church, the doctrine of our church, and the sacred text of our church to tell me as much. I would really like to see people make more of an effort to not tell the stories of the marginalized with the text, but see their brothers and sisters in the text. I brought up earlier tonight how President Nelson's statement on racism over a month ago talked about how Jesus Christ's primary mission was to people on the margins. I would like members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to take that more seriously. One of my favorite theologians, James Cone, talked about how the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ is not just consistent with Black liberation theology, but it is the gospel of Jesus Christ. The gospel of Jesus Christ is one for the marginalized, and we need to learn to apply it as such. I feel very strongly that if we are to fix our diversity program, and again, I think I've said this earlier tonight, we really have to commit ourselves to anti-racism with the gospel of Jesus Christ and do it on the terms of those who are most affected by systemic racism. At this particular moment, Black people. We have to do this on Black people's terms, not our own. I would love to see a day where we go on missions to places in Africa and we don't try to turn their congregations into our Utah congregations. I would love to see us doing and performing their music. I would love to see us baptizing people all over the world and preserving elements of their worship in ours. I feel like as a church, that's more or less what we're supposed to become and what we're supposed to do. We are going to change as we include more people and bring more diversity into the church. We're not supposed to make people assimilate to what Utah is. We are supposed to allow the gospel to become part of people's lives. We are supposed to allow people to make the gospel work for them in a way that's relatable to them, in their language, in their tongue, in their style of worship, whatever that may be. If we want to solve the diversity problem, we have to be able to meet people where they are. And that's one of the biggest messages of the Book of Mormon and of the New Testament, is Jesus Christ is meeting people where they are so that they can embrace his gospel. We in the church ought to take cues from Jesus Christ, ought to take cues from the sons of Mosiah, and we ought to meet people. That's one of my favorite things about the story of the sons of Mosiah. They went into the land of the Lamanites and they served them. They met them where they were on their terms, talked to King Lamoni and his father in terms that they could understand so that they could embrace the gospel. If we want to reach people, if we want to increase diversity, we have to meet people where they are and allow them to embrace the gospel of Jesus Christ on their own terms.
Preach, brother. I love it. I love it. I want to thank everyone literally from around the world who has joined us tonight. I want to thank especially my guests, Pactrick, Josh, Marvin, Laura, James. I'm inspired and I'm edified. I'm uplifted by the things that you've shared. There's lots of food for thought. There's still so much more to unpack in this discussion. That's why we're going to be doing this weekly. Sunday nights, same time, 8:30 p.m. Mountain Time. Marvin and I will be here next week, and you're invited to join, and even to join in on the panel if you'd like to. All of my panelists are invited back if you'd like to continue the discussion. But I really want to give a heartfelt thanks, and I want to close with a poem that was written by a slave and anonymously passed down. It's a short poem, but for those who don't like poetry, it's time for you to sign off, because this is a poem that I think really speaks to the human spirit, the resilience of the human spirit, and it inspires me to want to keep pressing forward like the church hymnal song teaches us to do. It inspires me to want to press forward even when I feel like giving up. And this song was adopted as the anthem by one of my all-time favorite poets, artists, activists, Ruby Dee. She and Maya Angelou both liked to recite this poem, and it was given to them by a friend who, again, had it passed down from a slave who is anonymous to this day. And the name of the poem is Today Is Ours. It's very short. Today is ours. Let's live it. And love is strong. Let's give it. A song can help. Let's sing it. And peace is dear. Let's bring it. The past is gone. Don't rue it. Our work is here. Let's do it. The world is wrong. Let's right it. The battle is hard. Let's fight it. The road is rough. Let's clear it. The future vast. Don't fear it. Is faith asleep? Let's wake it. Today is ours. Let's take it. Thank you all for joining me. Love to everyone. Thank you so much to our panelists for all your time, and to you, our worldwide church family. Love you and good night.